Um, I've also been an athlete pretty much as long as I can remember, from even before I can remember. I did gymnastics as a child and as a young person, and I competed at the international level and in the female category and the youth level. But I always I struggled with, because gymnastics is ridiculously gendered. Everything about gymnastics has to do with how you present yourself, especially when you do like floor routines. It's for the women. It's very much kind of very feminine, and you're supposed to kind of look after your hair as well and your makeup, and you're judged on aesthetics as well to some extent. And I always massively struggled with that. I did it because it was part of being successful. You have to, and also there was a general expectation across, like outside of competitions, that you're meant to present yourself in particular ways in order to kind of belong within the group. And I did those things because I thought that I had to, and it was many ways because I felt massively uncomfortable with the ways in which the sport was gendered that I stopped doing it at the point at which I reached the European sort of level, because then it became also kind of more of a, people would know this is what I do, people would expect things of me more. So I quit doing it. And I did not quite know why. I did not quite know why I felt really uncomfortable with all of it. I knew I was a lesbian, I knew I was kind of uncomfortable with all sorts of feminine presentations of these kinds of, especially with the dancing that was involved, and it's not dancing, but it's this particular ways of moving that I felt really uncomfortable with. But then I moved to Scotland after I quit sport at competitive level, and I became involved with the trans and non-binary politics there, because Scotland has, especially now, a more of an emerging kind of non-binary activism scene, and that's in many ways because kind of following like some other countries like Germany, for example, and New Zealand have introduced legal recognition of non-binary gender.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? I'm sure many of participants know of the terminology, but how would you define non-binary?
Oh, sorry. Well, okay, that's actually.
It's a big.
Well, yeah, that's fair enough. I keep talking about non-binary as if it was obvious what that means.
No, just for you.
But it's like non-binary are people who identify as non-binary. People who are non-binary are people who do not identify consistently or exclusively as women or men, or as male or female. So people who are non-binary is sort of like an umbrella concept. An identity category. So people who are non-binary might actually identify as gender fluid, as gender queer, for example. And non-binary is used as a sort of an umbrella term to capture everybody who doesn't fit within the sort of male-female, woman-man division. And a lot of people who are non-binary are trans, but not all people who are non-binary are trans. And not all people who are trans are non-binary, right? So, I identify as non-binary, but I don't identify as trans. I don't identify as a woman, nor as a female, but I also don't identify as a man or as male. Some days I feel more feminine, some days I feel more masculine, and it is reflected in how I present my gender. But I feel uncomfortable when people tell me I'm a woman because of the way that I look. People expect that I'm a woman, people read me as female. Unless I feel more masculine on those very masculine days. When I present more masculine, then people say, "Sir, oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am." So it's kind of this sort of like, what kind of weird are you? So people who are non-binary are have variety of different identities, variety of different presentations, but they generally are people who don't identify exclusively or consistently within the binary frame. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. I was telling some story about sort of now lost myself.
You were
a bit.
saying about how Scottish law.
Oh
and
yeah,
German-
yes, right. Okay.
Sorry, I
So no. Sorry, that's good. So back to the Scottish context. So there's been a consultation. So Scotland has this legal framework called the Gender Recognition Act, which is kind of the legal framework that gives trans people rights, right? And there has been a public consultation to think about whether or not this existing way of giving trans people rights should be reformed. And one of the things that have been activists in particular have been saying that we should do is to recognize non-binary gender by law, so to give a third gender category, and also to sort of make non-binary a protected, legally protected identity category. So what that means is that people who are non-binary would be explicitly recognized as a group that should kind of be protected against discrimination on the basis that they are non-binary. But then in response to this politics and these kinds of activism, the Ministry of Justice in the UK said that actually non-binary people face no specific detriment. So they face no specific kinds of challenges that would be particularly different from binary trans peoples or from kind of people who identify, so general gender equality legislation. So they were saying that non-binary people face no specific detriment, therefore they need no specific protection. In response to this claim, there's been sort of this activist sort of wave that's called specific detriment, right? To try to show the ways in which people who are non-binary face a specific challenge, face specific kinds of harms, specific types of discrimination. And part of this was this study that was run by the Scottish Trans Alliance, which aims to show the kinds of specific detriment, this kind of specific challenges that non-binary people face in Scotland. And a lot of this is to do with sex-segregated spaces. It's to do with all sorts of social areas of life that are divided into binary male and female categories. And of course, sports is one of the most centrally divided in this way. So if you want to take part in sport, but you don't want to take part in sport in the female category, in the male category, in the vast majority of cases, you just cannot take part in sport. Because almost all sports, mainstream as well as LGBT queer sports, are divided in this way. Of course, there are exceptions, but it is across the board divided. And when the Scottish Trans Alliance did the survey of non-binary people's experiences and the specific detriment that they face, one of the most significant obstacles is that was highlighted there is sport, because it's very hard to take part. The consequences of this for non-binary people are also significant. It was over 80% of people who feel that their identity is not valid. People feel excluded. People face significantly higher levels of physical disability as well as long-term health conditions, of mental health conditions. And because of this makes it even more difficult to do sport, even though sport would be one of these things that could help with these issues. So there's kind of like a double bind almost. So people are then been thinking, okay, what can we do to facilitate, to make it easier for non-binary people to take part in sports, to take part in gender segregated sort of environments. And some of the ways in which which inclusion can be facilitated are actually really quite simple, which will also help trans people, intersex people. So there are always two sort of levels of this. The first one is the practical things that can be done. Gender neutral changing facilities, gender neutral toilets, try to avoid using gender segregated kind of systems, whether it to be how space is divided or how organization is how participation is regulated. It's just some of these things are quite simple in this way, but some of these things are more complicated. And that is especially to do with competitions. So even though we might be able to make it easier for non-binary people to access sports as participation or at the participatory level, almost all competitive sports, when you reach that sort of standard that I was at, for example, that Erin was at, it's all divided into 2 gender categories. So how can you make it possible for non-binary people to take part when they are neither male nor female? What do you do? Well, one of the things that have been suggested is that we should introduce a 3rd gender category, a non-binary gender category, to enable non-binary people to participate. And in Scotland, some work is being done to do this. So the Scottish Athletics, which is the governing body of athletics in Scotland, have just very recently introduced a non-binary gender category for all athletics competitions. So I run. If I want to compete in running, I could now compete as non-binary. I wouldn't have to compete with women, which is what I usually would. Some people are arguing that this should be more broadly done, so that there should be a 3rd gender category in sport. Now, I think that's very possibly a good thing, but it also faces challenges of its own. So Erin was just talking about how intersex people, especially people who would like to compete as female, who identify as female, who have high testosterone levels, are being excluded from sport. Well, some people have then the kind of international governing bodies of sport have kind of said, oh, look, there's this possibility of having a 3rd gender category. Some people are saying this is a good thing. What we should then do is to introduce 3rd gender category so that we can put all the intersex and trans people there. You know, so this is the ways in which this is being used has a double-edged sword. So while introducing a non-binary category that would enable non-binary athletes like me to compete would be empowering for some, the way in which this idea is being used by others is to try to then say that women like Caster Semenya aren't actually women. They should run with the non-binary category. You know, and some trans women, they aren't really women. They should run with the non-binary category. So you are now in a double fold where kind of my identity is being used to discriminate against others in this way. So the extent to which non-binary category in sport is the correct solution is very, you know, I really don't know, and in this particular context it clearly isn't, because that's not how you want it. That's certainly not what I want. I certainly don't want my identity to be used as a punishment for others. So you're saying kind of like positive examples from the UK and so on. Well, there are some things that are kind of people are doing that are potentially empowering, that are potentially helpful at the same time as which, when you position these politics in the broader competitive international landscape, the extent to which it is empowering, the extent to which we should do this is a different question. So I think that's...
It can obviously be kind of appropriated for...
Exactly, co-opted almost as transphobic and intersexphobic.